The book of Genesis tells us that the first descendant of Abraham to arrive in Egypt was his great-grandson, Joseph, the son of Jacob. Joseph's brothers had sold him as a slave to a caravan of traders who brought him down to Egypt. Then, in an amazing turn of events, he rises to become the highest official in Egypt. He saves the country from a terrible famine, enables his father Jacob and his entire family to settle in the best part of the land, a place called Goshen.
Today, the archaeological site of Tel el-Daba lies in the heart of that area. I traveled there in 2002 to see it for myself and interview Professor Manfred Bietek, one of the world's leading Egyptologists. I asked him about his work and about the people that are routinely called the Hyksos, a foreign people living in Egypt.
The Austrian Archaeological Institute excavates in Tel el-Daba since 1966, and it's a lifetime of excavations. We uncovered the remains of a huge town of 250 hectares with a population of approximately 25,000 to 30,000 individuals. The site is well known in literature as Avaris, the capital of the Hyksos. These were people who originated from Canaan, Syria, Palestine. Originally, they may have come here as subjects of the Egyptian crown or with the blessing of the Egyptian crown as specialized settlers coming into Egyptian services like soldiers, trading agents, and even Egyptian officials. But obviously this town originally enjoyed something like a special status, like a free zone, if you could imagine something like that. Similarly, as in the first millennium, in the time of the 26th dynasty, Naucratis served for a Greek community. Here was a Canaanite community, and in times of internal strife, political strife in Egypt, when the Middle Kingdom broke into pieces, this community was able to exploit this situation and create a kingdom of their own, known as the Hyksos, the Hekau Chassut, the rulers of the foreign country. Under this title, they are known also in the Egyptian king lists, in the Manethonian king list, but also in older king lists as the Papyrus of Turin, and they were acknowledged as an official dynasty, what is very interesting. So this town had, displays in excavations, a mixture between Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern Bronze Age culture, to be seen in temples of Near Eastern origin, and to be seen also in the weaponry and ceramical production.
Is there evidence, as you were writing, you've written a book on the Exodus, of these Asiatic people, would they from Canaan land, would they be considered Hebrews or?
This is an old issue. Flavius Josephus identified the Hyksos as ancestors of the ancient Hebrews, but this was in Roman times, and after many years of research, and I have the full support, and I'm in good company with many other scholars, there can be no doubt that the Hyksos were not the ancestors of the Hebrews. They were urban Canaanites originating from urban centers in Syria, Palestine, or what is nowadays also Lebanon. But according to my opinion, again, they have nothing to do with the Proto-Israelites. One could make a case only that the expulsion of the Hyksos in a later tradition was used in order to imagine something like a happening of an exodus. Some scholars make such a case, but this is, let us say, using an older event half a millennium later to match it with other traditions. And if one could do that, I mean, I would say it's debatable at least.
This subject of the Hyksos has been the source of a great amount of misunderstanding. One common tendency among scholars is to wrongly lump the entire period of Semitic occupation at the site of Avaris into one phase called the Hyksos period. Professor James Huffmeyer shared more about these Hyksos people. Now, Manfred Bitek has uncovered a large Semitic population in this area. Could you talk about what he's found?
The excavations at Tel Adaba have produced what was the capital of the Hyksos, or foreign rulers, who reigned in Egypt roughly from about 1650 or 1675 down to about 1550. For about 150 years, we have a very strong population of foreign West Semitic peoples living in the northeastern delta. And in the 17th century, in the 1600s, they actually take over and rule the north of Egypt.
But an examination of Bitek's own dig reports of the site show that there was not one, but two distinct phases at Avaris, and the Hyksos are properly understood to be the second of those two phases.
We mentioned the Hyksos and the fact that they had established their capital at this site, and it was called Avaris. And the Hyksos actually ruled the Egyptians for about 100 years, up until about 1550 BC or so. And finally, the Egyptians were able to drive them out and regain control of their country. The difficulty here is you have, I believe, two different groups of Asiatic people coming into Egypt. The earlier one, we could relate to the Israelites. They were very poor. They were pastoralists. The next layer, next level of occupation, was this very well-to-do Canaanite class of people who are referred to in the Egyptian text as Hyksos. That simply means shepherd kings, or foreign kings rather, foreign kings. They came from southern Canaan as well, and so it's easy to, get confused. But economically, they were totally different. This Hyksos class were merchants involved in international trade, much different than that lower level of poor shepherds, you could call them. But if you do date that tomb to the lower level and say it's contemporary with the village, then you have something very, very interesting there.
One aspect that Bryant Wood is overlooking is that the beginning of the early phase at Avaris was not actually poor. As seen in the multiplication bonus feature, the early tombs produced exquisite daggers made of gold, ivory, and bronze, as well as this magnificent bronze belt. And Bitek stated that this first group was allowed to settle in the area by invitation, whereas the Hyksos were oppressors of the native Egyptians. It is this first group that David Rohl has identified as the Israelites, and not the later Hyksos. These Semites also gained high governmental positions. Their plummet to poverty matches the biblical account of enslavement, and David Rohl's explanation of what happened next fits the idea of a mass exodus.
This city of Avaris begins at the end of the 12th dynasty in Egypt. This is called the Middle Kingdom, around the time of King Amenemhat III. And this is where we have this little village of around 12, 15 houses or so. And over the 13th dynasty, which immediately follows this is the city that expands into this massive, huge place, one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Now, this is Avaris in stratum G. So we go from H, the foundation stratum, in the late 12th dynasty, and then we go into G, which is the 13th dynasty stratum. This can last several hundred years, G.
The remains from these levels of H and G are the group that David Rohl has identified as the Israelites. The Hyksos rulers would come in later and dominate Egypt for more than 100 years. So David does not think that the Israelites were the Hyksos. He thinks the exodus of the Israelites caused the conditions that led to the Hyksos invasion of Egypt.
And then, right at the end of G, we find an extraordinary thing happens. The archaeologists have been digging this area, suddenly find lots of pits in the ground. And in these pits are bodies, and they've been tossed into these pits. They're not buried formally. They have no grave goods or anything like that. These bodies are tossed on top of each other. They're lying strewn. You have hands and legs crossing over. What is happening here? What is going on? We have no evidence, for instance, of cut wounds on the bones. There's no battle going on here, no warfare. BTAC thinks it's actually some sort of plague that's happened, a dramatic event where suddenly they have to bury people very quickly because of contamination of the living population. So it's an emergency burial. And then, all of a sudden, all these Semitic peoples who were living there suddenly get up, they pack their bags and they leave, and the whole mound is abandoned. And we don't know for how long, and it just falls to ruin. Now, isn't that just like the story of Exodus?
What happened to the nation of Egypt after this?
Well, if we can do this, and this is an important point really, if we can link this to a very famous tradition told to us by an Egyptian priest called Manetho. He wrote a history of Egypt in the 3rd century BC. He lived in Alexandria, and he wrote this history for the Ptolemaic pharaohs, the Greek pharaohs who came along after Alexander conquered the world. And he was asked to write this history of Egypt. And at one point in time, he writes about the invasion of the Hyksos kings. Now, this is in the same time period of this archaeology we've been talking about. And what we end up with is a story like this. In the reign of a king called Ptolemaios. Now remember that Manetho's writing in Greek for his Greek audience, the Ptolemies. So Ptolemaios is actually an Egyptian pharaoh called Dudimos, and he's one of the last kings of the 13th dynasty. In his reign, God smote the Egyptians. And God here is singular. You would expect to see, and the gods smote the Egyptians, but you don't. You see God smote the Egyptians. And then, because of the smiting, whatever the smiting is, foreigners, people of obscure race, invade Egypt from the north, and they conquer the land without striking a blow, is the term. Now, why? Because God had smote the Egyptians. Egypt had been flawed. Something had happened to devastate Egypt, which made them unable to defend themselves from these marauding hordes. And these marauding hordes took over the whole country, and we call this the Hyksos period, and they enslaved the Egyptians. Egypt was brought down to its knees by these people, but the point is, they could have defended themselves, they had a mighty army, except for the fact that God had smitten the Egyptians.
So something happened in the history of Egypt that caused them to be taken over by northern armies.
Absolutely. And that something could be this terrible plague we see at Avaris at the end of Stratum G. That could be the smiting of God. And that matches beautifully the story of the 10th plague in Exodus.
Well, there's another event that happened, which was the destruction of the army and the chariots in the sea.
Red Sea. Absolutely.
And so there's a vacuum there.
Absolutely. If you follow the logic of the argument through, not only do we have this terrible plague, and in the Bible we even hear of 10 plagues, but we have archaeological evidence for one of them, the most dramatic of all, the last one. But of course the story then proceeds on to the Sea of Reeds, where the army of Egypt is devastated, is completely destroyed. And therefore this could be part of the smiting of God also. So this allows these foreign hordes to enter Egypt unopposed, because the Egyptian army has been decimated.
The Bible's book of Deuteronomy is said to have been written at the end of Moses' life, 40 years after the Exodus. But here the text emphasizes a litany of actions taken by God to free the Israelites from Egypt, including the following verse. And what he did unto the army of Egypt, unto their horses, and to their chariots, how he made the water of the Red Sea to overflow them as they pursued after you, and how the Lord hath destroyed them unto this day. So according to the biblical account, Egypt was in a state of defeat for at least 40 years after the Exodus.
Let's talk about the collapse of an Egyptian society around the Exodus.
There's really only one period in Egyptian history spanning 1,000 years where you have total collapse like this, where you have a foreign invasion and Egypt is on its knees, and that's the Hyksos period. And in that period must be the time of the Exodus of of the Israelites. And why don't we put the two things together then? We have the story of the 10 plagues, the destruction of Egypt, the collapse of Egyptian civilization, the Israelites leaving Egypt, and Egypt itself is on its knees for several hundred years. That's what we see in the archaeological evidence at this period. You look for a collapse in Egyptian civilization, and that's where you'll find Moses and the Exodus.
In this collapse, how long was it dark during that period of time?
Well, if we look at the archaeological evidence, when the city of Osiris is abandoned, we can't determine how long the city was abandoned for. We know that the houses collapsed and fell into ruin, so it could have been 10 years, it could have been 20 years, difficult to say. But then these Hyksos arrive in Egypt, and they flatten the whole of the mound, and they build a large cemetery on top of it with great big mortuary temples dedicated to the god Baal. So we know they're coming from the north, or they worship Baal. These are Baal worshippers. We can't say how long that is, but it seems that at least 2 centuries are involved here. 200 years of occupation by foreign kings and their tribes and their military men occupying Egypt, dominating the north, suppressing the Egyptians for about 200 years.
But what you're saying is that Egypt prior to this was a mighty power.
Egypt was a great power in the Middle Kingdom, and then during the 13th dynasty there was a slow decline, but not sufficient a decline to prevent them from repelling an attack from foreigners. We're talking about foreign hordes here. We're talking about a rabble army. We're not talking about sophisticated warfare. Something else must have happened which changed things in Egypt dramatically, and Manetho tells us what it is. He says God smote the Egyptians.